At 11:40 on a February night, inside 30th Street Station in Philadelphia, a woman in a thin coat stopped a stranger to ask for directions. Her name was Cora Lindstrom, 28 years old, a nurse who wasn't allowed to nurse anybody anymore, the toes of her work shoes held together with white medical tape. In one hand, she carried a canvas bag with everything she still owned. With the other, she was holding up her younger brother, 19, tall and thin, in a way that didn't come from being young. The man she stopped wore a black overcoat and looked like someone who didn't wait in line for anything. 34 years old, dark hair going gray early at the temples, a thin scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Half the men in South Philadelphia lowered their eyes when he walked past them, and she had no idea who he was. He was already reaching to point her toward the exit. Then she told him where she was headed. She said the name of the place out loud, the way you'd read it off a slip of paper, because that's exactly what she was doing. And Salvatore Ruggiero went completely still in the middle of a train station. She didn't notice. She was watching her brother, who couldn't stand much longer. She never saw the man's hand close around something in his coat pocket. What she also didn't know was that in 6 hours, at 6 in the morning, this man was scheduled for a surgery he'd waited 3 years to get. The kind you don't move, the kind that decides how much life a person has left. 7 minutes later, he made a phone call and pushed it back. And the strangest part isn't that he did it. The strangest part is that he couldn't have explained why. Not to his doctor, not to the one man alive who knew his secret, and not to himself. If stories like this one mean something to you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it's the only reason this channel keeps going. Thank you for being here. Now let's go back to that station, to the woman with the taped shoes and the man in the black coat, and to the 7 minutes that changed both of their lives. He asked her to say it again. Cora thought she must have heard him wrong, so she repeated the name of the place she needed to reach, a little more slowly this time, the way people speak to someone who has only just awakened. He still didn't move. She held out the piece of paper, softened from being folded and unfolded in her coat pocket throughout the entire journey, bearing the slanted handwriting of some head nurse who had been on the other end of the telephone that afternoon, along with a street name and one brief line of instructions. He didn't take it. He only looked. He looked for so long that she finally had to lower her hand, and in that moment, she thought perhaps she had chosen the wrong person to ask. Perhaps this man couldn't read, or didn't want to become involved in the troubles of strangers, and she was standing there wasting both his time and her own. She was about to thank him and leave, but just then, a very faint sound came from behind her, the whisper of fabric brushing against the stone floor. And when she turned, Wesley was sitting flat on the station floor, with his back against a pillar, his legs stretched straight out before him like a man who had traveled the last stretch of road his body could carry him. She knelt beside him. She asked if he was all right, and he nodded, because he always nodded. He said he only needed to sit for a little while, and she shouldn't make a scene in the middle of the station. When she took hold of his arm to help him up, his sleeve slipped a few inches above his wrist, and beneath the station's yellow light, the raised line running along his forearm showed with terrible clarity, the kind of line anyone who had ever walked the corridor of a kidney ward would recognize at once. Cora hurriedly tugged his sleeve back down by instinct, an instinct she had carried for years, the instinct to hide the thing that made people look at her brother differently. But it was too late. The man had seen it. And what sent a chill down her spine wasn't that he had seen it, but the way he looked at it. Strangers usually frowned when they saw something like that, or turned away, or worse, asked some foolish question. He did none of those things. He studied that raised line the way a person looks at something he knows so well that no questions are needed. The way a craftsman looks at a weld and knows at once who made it. Then he said, in a low, even voice, that he would take them there. Cora straightened. She thanked him, but said she didn't get into cars with strangers. There was no sharpness in her voice. She said it simply, as if reciting a rule that had settled into her very bones. The rule of a woman who had lived long enough in places where unexpected kindness often came with a price, and that price was always higher than whatever she had been given. She waited for him to become angry. Men like him often became angry when they were refused. He didn't. He only gave the faintest shrug and said, "All right." Then they would walk. She stared at him. She said it was snowing outside, and the place wasn't close. He replied that he knew exactly how far away it was. He didn't say it boastfully. He said it like a man repeating his own home address. Wesley, still sitting on the floor, looked up at the two of them and gave a quiet laugh. the laugh of a 19-year-old boy who had learned to turn every terrible thing into a joke so his sister would be less afraid, and he said that if they were going to walk anyway, he would like permission to sit for another 30 seconds. The man didn't smile. He stepped forward, and Cora's entire body tightened, her hand already curling into a fist, but he didn't touch her brother. He removed the black coat he was wearing, doing it slowly, without any haste, then laid it across Wesley's shoulders and drew the collar up around the back of his neck, as though this were something he did every day. Wesley tried to refuse. The man said only that it was much colder outside than it was in here, and he would need the coat before they reached the end of the first block. It was when he leaned forward that the cuff of his left shirt sleeve slipped back by the width of a finger joint. Cora saw it for only a fraction of a breath. Then his hand dropped, and everything was as it had been. But she had seen it. Beneath the white fabric, close to the edge of his wrist, was a piece of gauze wrapped with meticulous care, the kind of bandage only someone trained would know how to make, or someone who had dressed his own wounds so many times that he had mastered it. She lifted her eyes to his face. He had already turned away and was walking toward the exit, and he didn't explain a thing. To understand why a man like that would take off his own coat and give it to a strange boy in a train station near midnight, one had to go back a few days, to the old house on Cardone Street, where every Sunday afternoon, a dining table was still set exactly as it had been for decades. In Salvatore Ruggiero's world, every matter was settled at that table. No one brought anything into the room but his own 2 hands. No one was allowed to rise before he did, and that Sunday afternoon, just as the second course was served, everyone at the table already knew what was about to happen, except the man who was about to receive it. Nunzio sat 2 seats away from him, eating noisily, telling some story about the previous week's shipment, laughing before he had even reached the part that was supposed to be funny. Money had been disappearing from the union fund for 3 months in a row, and it hadn't gone far. It had merely passed through 2 names before finding its way back into Nunzio's pocket. Sal had known about it since the first month. He had waited until the 3rd, not because he needed more proof, but because he wanted to know how far Nunzio would go if no one stopped him. Nunzio hadn't stopped. Sal didn't shout. He didn't stand up either. He simply reached for the platter of meat in front of him and slid it toward Nunzio, slowly, like a caring uncle encouraging his nephew to eat a little more. Then, in the same ordinary voice, he said that the nursing home on the east side had just sent its bill for the new quarter. Nunzio stopped chewing. Sal went on, saying that his mother was still in the same room, the one with the window overlooking the courtyard, and that they still wheeled her outside every sunny afternoon. He said everyone at that table knew how long he had been paying those bills, so there was no need to remind them. He only wanted Nunzio to understand one thing. Starting the following week, Sal wouldn't pay any more. Starting the following week, Nunzio would take care of it himself. Not one person at the table lifted a fork. The man at the far end had been pouring wine, but he stopped midway, the neck of the bottle suspended over the rim of the glass. Nunzio opened his mouth to speak, and Sal looked at him in a way that made him close it again. Sal said he wouldn't lay a hand on him, wouldn't take a single cent from him, and no one in that room would come looking for him. He said Nunzio could keep the money he had taken and consider it an interest-free loan. Then he delivered the final sentence, more softly than anything he had said before. When Nunzio knew what it felt like to stand at the admissions desk of a place like that, without enough money to pay, he could come back here, sit in this very chair, and the 2 of them would continue their conversation. Nunzio remained there, staring at the platter of meat growing cold in front of him. No one helped him finish it. Lunch continued in the way lunch had to continue. They passed the bread, talked about the weather, and laughed at jokes that sounded flatter than usual. Then the man seated to Sal's right passed a dish across the table, and as he did, the back of his hand brushed against Sal's left forearm. Sal jerked his arm away. It was only 1 beat faster than an ordinary person would have reacted to an accidental touch. Only 1 beat, and immediately afterward, he lowered his hand beneath the table and picked up his glass of water as if that were what he had intended to do all along. No one at the table noticed. Aldo Serafino did. He was sitting diagonally across from Sal, his fork still planted in his food, and in the instant Sal pulled his arm back, Aldo saw what appeared beneath the edge of his cuff, a thin white border of gauze, narrow but enough. Aldo said nothing. He didn't ask. He only shifted his eyes toward the man beside him and held them there longer than an ordinary glance before lowering his head and returning to his meal. That night, in the basement of a pharmacy across the river, Sal sat in the chair where he had spent 3 nights a week for the past 2 years. Bruno Ferraro stood guard at the stairs and didn't look inside, because Sal had ordered him not to from the very first night. Within the organization, people whispered that he had a woman across the river, and that was why he disappeared so regularly on those appointed nights. Sal knew about the rumor. He had deliberately allowed it to live. A man with a mistress was still a man. A sick man was nothing at all. He leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and slipped his right hand into his coat pocket, turning a brass key over and over between his fingers, its edges worn smooth on 2 sides. He did it without even knowing he was doing it. While Salvatore Ruggiero sat in the basement across the river, several blocks to the west, inside a car parked in the darkest corner of a supermarket lot, Cora Lindstrom was doing what she did every night before going to sleep. She was checking once more to see what was left that day. She kept the most important document pressed between 2 pages of her notebook, so it wouldn't become wrinkled, though in truth it already was. At the top of the page was the seal of the Pennsylvania State Board of Nursing, and beneath it were several lines she had read so many times that she knew them without looking, stating, in essence, that her nursing license had been temporarily suspended pending a hearing. Temporarily. They wrote that word as though it could comfort anyone. The telephone call had come about a week before the letter, from the hospital's Human Resources Department, in a voice so polite it was cruel, informing her that she had been removed from the entire duty schedule beginning with her next shift, and that they advised her to contact an attorney. She asked whether anyone had reviewed the note she had entered in the patient's medical record that day. The woman on the other end said that matter didn't fall within her authority. Then the call ended just as politely as it had begun. Cora placed the document back between the 2 pages of her notebook. She plugged a small pot into the power socket on the dashboard, something she had bought at a second-hand store the previous fall, without ever imagining that one day she would depend on it to survive, then poured in half a can of soup and sat waiting. While she waited, she opened the notebook and turned to the last page, where she kept a list of everything that had to be paid that month. Gas, anti-rejection medication for the treatments ahead. The monthly installment sent to the company that had purchased her mother's medical debt, a company with a long, cumbersome name printed across its envelopes, one she had grown so accustomed to that she no longer read it. She only had to see the envelope to know how much money had to be set aside. She wrote down that amount exactly as she did every month, without giving it another thought, the way people wrote down the electric bill. Then she crossed out the 2 lines beneath it, because she couldn't afford to pay either of them that month. Wesley was asleep in the back seat, his face turned toward the seat back. She looked at the nape of his neck in the darkness, and thought about the news she had received the week before. The news she still hadn't spoken a word of to him. His name had been removed from the transplant waiting list. It wasn't because his condition had worsened, nor because someone else deserved the chance more than he did. It was only because, during the months when she couldn't manage the required co-payments, he had missed more dialysis sessions than the rules allowed. And in a medical record, someone who missed a session was someone who failed to comply with treatment, and someone who failed to comply with treatment wasn't permitted to keep his place in line. No one asked why he had missed those sessions. There was no box on the form where that answer could be written. 3 nights earlier, when she had run out of places to call, she called Doreen Kowalski, a head nurse she had never met and knew only through an old acquaintance. Cora told her everything in a calm voice, without pleading, because she knew people didn't help those who cried and begged. Doreen remained silent for a very long time on the other end of the line. Then she told Cora to write down the street name. She said they had an open chair and a folding bed in the family room, and told her not to wait until morning. She was to bring the boy there that very night. Cora asked how much it would cost. Doreen said they didn't ask that question there. Sitting in the car as steam began to rise from the soup, Cora remembered an evening many years earlier, when her mother was still alive. Her mother had been in pain since the afternoon but had hidden it, refusing to call her daughter until late that night. On the way to the emergency room, she sat in the passenger seat with both hands resting in her lap, apologizing over and over. She apologized for troubling her daughter at that hour. She said Cora had already worked all day, and she had planned to wait until morning. Cora remembered telling her mother to be quiet and let her drive. She remembered that her voice had been a little too sharp. She would remember the sound of her own voice saying those words for the rest of her life. The soup began to boil. She switched off the pot, poured the soup into a plastic cup, then sat motionless for a long while, staring through the fogged window. She didn't cry. She had already counted everything again. She had counted the money in her wallet so many times that there was no need to count it anymore. She had counted the nights she and her brother had slept in the car until she finally stopped counting, and now there was nothing left to count. She put the lid on the cup to keep the soup from growing cold, turned around, and gently shook her brother's shoulder. Then she spoke softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "All right, what do we do next?" Outside the station, the snow fell thin and wet, the kind that melted the moment it touched the sidewalk, and the three of them turned north along a road only one of them knew. After they had gone about a block, the man spoke without looking back, calling over his shoulder to ask whether the boy had glomerular disease, the rare kind. Cora stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk. She asked him what he had just said. He took 2 more steps before stopping and turning to look at her. He said he was only asking. She said people didn't ask a question like that. They asked what was wrong with the boy, or they didn't ask anything at all. No one had ever named his illness correctly at first sight on the street. He said he was sorry then. She said she didn't need an apology. She needed to know how he knew. He fell silent. He remained silent for so long that Wesley had to step in, because Wesley always stepped in when the air began to grow too heavy. He said the man probably worked in social services, and people in that line of work could tell everything with a single look. Then he glanced down at the man's shoes and added that, on second thought, probably not, because no social worker wore shoes like those. He had sat across from every kind of social worker there was, and they all wore shoes bought on sale. The man looked at him. Then he laughed. It was only one sound, short and dry, like something that hadn't been used in so long that it rasped when finally brought out again. He said Wesley was right. Wesley asked what he did for a living. Then, the man said construction. Wesley said that explained it. Then he asked how someone in construction knew about his illness, and Cora told him to be quiet, while the man said that someone he had once known had suffered from it too. Wesley asked what had happened to that person. The man said that person had died. Wesley nodded and asked nothing more, because he was the kind of person who knew when to stop. They continued walking. After a while, Cora spoke first, perhaps because the silence had become more uncomfortable than talking. She asked if he intended to ask why she and her brother were walking through the night with a single bag. He said no. She said she would tell him anyway and get it over with, because she hated the feeling that people were making guesses about her behind her back. She said she was a nurse, or she used to be. She said that during one of her shifts, an elderly woman had been prescribed the wrong dosage. Cora discovered it, and did exactly what she had been trained to do. She entered it in the medical record and reported it to her superiors. She said the woman was all right. Thank God, she was all right. Then she said that by the following week, the medical record had been changed, and the name beside the error was no longer the resident physician's. The man asked for the name of the hospital. She said Bramwell. He asked who had signed the decision. She said the executive director, a woman named Stroud. He asked about the other person. She said Vance, Dr. Preston Vance, and she spoke the name in a flat voice, the voice of someone who had repeated it in her mind so many times that it had been worn smooth. He didn't say anything. He offered no sign of sympathy, didn't tell her how unfair it was, and didn't ask what she planned to do next. He simply kept walking, and Cora thought perhaps he hadn't heard her, or perhaps he didn't care. And in truth, she felt relieved by that. She didn't know that inside the man's mind, those 3 names had just been set down with great precision, in the exact order she had given them, and that they would remain there. Halfway to their destination, Wesley began to fall behind. He didn't say anything. He simply walked more slowly, with every step, the canvas bag on his shoulder dragging him to one side. The man turned back, took hold of the strap, and swung the bag onto his own shoulder. As he raised his arm, his left sleeve slipped back slightly. Wesley caught a glimpse of what lay beneath it, then looked away and thanked him. The 3 of them continued. Wesley asked if they had much farther to go. The man said they would cross 2 more intersections, and then turn left. Wesley asked if he traveled this road often. The man said he hadn't been this way in a long time. Wesley asked how long a long time was, and Cora once again told him to stop asking questions. But the man said it had been a very long time, and he said it in a way that made no one want to ask anything more. Wesley released a breath that turned white in the air, then said that he had spent a great deal of time in waiting rooms, and he had noticed that everyone who went with him always asked whether he was afraid. The man asked if he was. Wesley said no, He was only tired. Then, more quietly, he added that the man was the first person who hadn't asked him that question. At the final intersection, they turned left, and the street opened before them, short and narrow, with a 3-story red brick building halfway down the block, and light spilling from its ground-floor windows, the only light still awake anywhere on that street at that hour. Cora looked at the sign beside the door, then turned back and thanked him. She said it properly, without gushing, in the manner of someone who knew she had just been given something she could never repay. Wesley took off the coat and tried to return it, but the man told him to keep wearing it and give it back tomorrow. Wesley asked if he would be coming tomorrow. The man didn't answer. He only nodded toward the door and told them to go inside because someone was waiting for them. The door opened, and warmth poured out with the smell of antiseptic. A middle-aged woman stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on Wesley's shoulder, and the door closed behind them. Salvatore Ruggiero remained exactly where he was. He stood several paces from the first step and didn't move any closer. He looked up. A window on the second floor was lit, probably the break room for the night staff. The third floor was dark. All 3 windows on the third floor were dark, and the one at the far right, the one with an iron frame older than the other 2, was the one he couldn't stop looking at. No complete image ever came back to him. It never returned whole. There were only 3 things. Always those same 3 things, and nothing else. The apartment door standing open by the width of a hand, something it was never supposed to do because she had always warned him to keep it firmly closed. The beige telephone mounted on the kitchen wall, its coiled cord hanging down until it touched the floor, and the feeling of warm plastic in the palm of a boy who kept pressing the receiver against his ear as they told him they were coming. They were already on their way. And the clock hanging above the sink, the white plastic clock with a blue rim that she had bought at the grocery store at the end of the block, its second hand moving forward 1 mark at a time, neither faster nor slower, utterly indifferent. It continued that way for 51 minutes. From a little after 6, 10 until the sound of a stretcher's wheels rolling down the hallway. 51 minutes. He had lived for 20 years with that number lodged somewhere beneath his breastbone, and he had never spoken it aloud to anyone. Snow gathered on the shoulders of his shirt because his coat was inside the building, draped around a 19-year-old boy he had met less than an hour ago. He took out his phone. He selected the number from his contacts, a number he had never needed to call outside business hours, and Dr. Renata Kaplan answered after the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep but instantly alert when she saw his name on the screen. She asked what was wrong. He said nothing was wrong. He said he needed to postpone tomorrow morning's procedure. She fell silent. Then she asked whether he understood what he had just said. He told her he did. He said it would only be for 1 week. There was something he had to finish first. She asked what it was. He said it was his business. She told him she had reviewed his results that afternoon, that he was no longer at the point where a person could afford to squander time, and that there were people who spent their entire lives on the waiting list without ever receiving what he now held in his hands. People who would give everything they had for it. He said he already knew all of that. She told him to explain it to her. Then, he didn't. He stood there in the middle of the deserted street, staring at the dark window on the 3rd floor, and realized that if she asked him one more question, he still wouldn't have anything to say, because he didn't know the answer himself. She breathed out at the other end of the line, the weary sigh of someone who had argued with men like him too many times. She said 1 week. She said she would rearrange the schedule, but she wanted it entered into his medical record that she objected. He told her to write it down. Then he ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and his hand brushed against the brass key already resting there. The following night, when Wesley had been in the dialysis chair for about an hour, and Cora had just lowered herself into the plastic chair in the hallway for the first time in 2 days, the front door opened. The man walked in with the cold still clinging to the shoulders of his shirt, and he went directly to the reception desk and stopped there. He didn't come any farther inside. He didn't look toward the hallway leading to the dialysis room either. He placed a bound stack of papers on the counter, then called her name. Cora rose and walked toward him, and she realized at once that she was moving more slowly than usual, the way people approach something they haven't yet read, but already suspect they understand. He turned the papers around to face her. She glanced at the first page, then she looked up at him and asked what it was. He said it was an agreement. He told her to read it because he didn't like explaining things that had already been put in writing. Cora lowered her eyes and began to read. The first page stated that his side would assume the full cost of Wesley Lindstrom's medical care, including dialysis, medication, tests, and every expense connected with restoring his name to the transplant waiting list, as well as the surgery itself if one became available, with no time limit and no limit on the total amount. She read that line a second time. The second page described what was required in return. She would serve as his private nurse 3 nights a week, at times and locations determined by his side, and her work would be strictly medical. One clause stated that she wasn't permitted to ask questions about anything beyond the scope of his medical care, that she couldn't mention the place where she worked to anyone, and that any violation would terminate the agreement immediately. Several more pages followed, crowded with fine print and dry legal language that the eye passed over almost by instinct. She quickly flipped through the final pages without reading them, then turned back to the beginning. She said she didn't understand. She said her license had been suspended, and people didn't hire nurses whose licenses had been suspended. He said he didn't need her license. He needed her hands. She said there was no shortage of nurses in the city, including some who would accept cash and ask no questions. He said that was true. Then he said most of them had husbands, friends, relatives who worked somewhere, someone waiting at home to hear about their day. She didn't. He said she was the only person in the city who knew how to insert a needle properly and had no one to sell him out to. Cora stood motionless. He had just spoken aloud a truth she had never been willing to put into words herself. She had no one left. Other than the brother lying in that chair, there wasn't a single person in the world she could call in the middle of the night. She said that wasn't a compliment. He said it wasn't meant to be. She asked what would happen if she didn't sign. He said the boy would still receive treatment there, because that place never turned anyone away, but putting his name back on the waiting list would require more than kindness. She asked what would happen if she signed and then made a mistake. He said she would correct it. She asked what would happen if she signed and one day wanted to leave. This time, he was silent longer. Then he said the part concerning her could end whenever she wanted, but once the part concerning the boy had been signed, it could never be withdrawn. Cora looked at him. She wanted to ask who he was, why he was doing this, and what was beneath the bandage hidden by his cuff. But all 3 questions lay outside the limits permitted by the document in front of her, and she understood that if she asked them, everything would end right there. She picked up the pen. She signed on the final line of the page, signing quickly, the way people plunge into cold water without counting to 3. He didn't thank her. He folded the papers neatly, then said someone would come for her at 9 o'clock on Tuesday night. With that, he turned and walked toward the door. Cora remained alone at the reception desk with the pen still in her hand, and she felt something unmistakable inside her chest. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't fear. She had just sold some part of herself. She didn't yet know what it was, but she had sold it, and she hated herself for having sold it so quickly. He hadn't yet reached the door when the sound of slippers moved across the tile behind him, and a woman's voice rose through the hallway, not loud, but carrying the tone people use only when they have waited a very long time to say what comes next. She called him by the name no one in that city dared to use anymore. Doreen Kowalski stood in the middle of the hallway with a patient file still in her hand, and her glasses pushed up onto her forehead, looking him over from head to toe, the way someone looks at a nephew who has finally come home after running away for years. She said she had recognized him the night before, while he was standing outside in the snow. She said she had watched him from behind the window curtain and waited to see whether he would climb the steps. He said nothing. She told him to come inside. He said he had to leave. She told him to come inside, and this time it wasn't a request. He followed her past the reception desk and into the stretch of hallway, where drawings made by patients were taped to the walls. And for the first time in 9 years, Salvatore Ruggiero crossed farther than the threshold of the building he had purchased with his own money. Doreen turned to face him in the middle of the hallway. She asked if he knew about the machine in the room at the very end, the new one that had been installed the previous fall. He said he did. She said of course he knew because the invoice had been sent to him. She said every month the electric bill was paid before she even had time to worry about it. She said the box of needles out there, the light over the entrance, the furnace she had been asking to repair since 3 winters ago, all of it had been paid for with his money, and she was grateful for that. She had never denied it for a single day. Then she asked if he knew who sat at that machine. He didn't answer. She said the woman who used it was named Hattie. She was 74 years old, and every time she came for treatment, she brought a scarf she had knitted herself, because her hands were always cold. She said the man in the chair beside her was a house painter who still went to work in the mornings and came there in the afternoons. He asked after everyone in the room, even those who had only just arrived. She asked if Sal wanted to hear the names of all the others. He said no. Doreen stepped closer. She said she would tell him something. Then, for 9 years, he had paid the electric bills and bought the machines. He had paid for every needle in that building, yet he had never once looked into the face of a single person he had saved. She said he believed that was love. It wasn't. It was running away with the invoices attached. She said money was the easiest thing in the world for a man like him to give away. What he couldn't give, what his mother would demand of him if she were still alive, was to walk through that door and sit beside a stranger while they were afraid. Salvatore didn't argue. He could have. He had argued with people far more powerful than Doreen Kowalski many times in his life, and he had never lost a single one of those battles. But he stood there in the hallway, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the steady rhythm of machines drifting from the room beyond, and he couldn't find one thing to say. Doreen watched him for a moment, then lowered her voice. She said she hadn't told him those things to hurt him. She had said them because she was the last person alive who still had the right. Then she turned away, slid her glasses back into place, and told him that now that he had come this far inside, he shouldn't stand out in the snow next time. People could see him. He left. On his way to the door, he had to pass the foot of the staircase. The wooden staircase with a blue-painted railing that led to the 2nd floor and then the 3rd. He knew exactly how many steps it had. He knew the 4th step from the bottom creaked if someone put his foot on the right edge. And he knew that inside his coat pocket, he still carried the thing that could open the door at the very top, the thing he had kept with him for so long that he could no longer remember the day he had begun carrying it. He passed the foot of the staircase without looking up. Not once. He kept his eyes fixed on the door, pushed it open, and stepped outside. Only when the cold struck his face did he realize he had been holding his breath for the entire length of the hallway. On Tuesday night, at exactly 9 o'clock, a black car stopped outside the door, and the driver said nothing except her name. They crossed the bridge, turned onto a street where the pharmacy had already closed, and Cora was led down a narrow staircase at the rear of the building. Below was a small room, unexpectedly clean, with a reclining chair, a machine whose every button she knew by heart, and a broad-shouldered man standing at the foot of the stairs. He didn't greet her. He only gave her a single nod, then turned his back and went outside to stand guard. Salvatore was already seated in the chair. He said the person who usually did this for him couldn't come that night because of a family matter. Cora asked how long it had been. He said that question was outside the permitted scope. She said no, it was within the scope, because she needed to know how long the access had been in use, so she would know how careful she had to be. He studied her for a moment, then said 2 years. She nodded, washed her hands, opened the tray, and began her work. She rolled up his left sleeve. The raised line beneath his skin appeared along its full length, and she said nothing. She didn't gasp, didn't grimace, and didn't ask how something like this could have happened. She simply placed 2 fingers against it and sat motionless, listening with her fingertips in the way she had been taught during her first year of training. The room was so quiet that they could hear the machine breathing softly in the corner. 4 minutes passed that way, with her feeling along the axis and him staring at the ceiling, neither of them speaking a word. Then she told him to unclench his fist. He didn't move. She repeated herself, still gently, saying he was gripping too tightly. If he kept squeezing like that, the pulse would mislead her, and if she followed the wrong pulse, she would miss, and he would have to endure another attempt. He said he wasn't accustomed to it. She asked what he wasn't accustomed to. He was silent for a moment, then said he wasn't accustomed to letting anyone touch that arm. Cora looked up at him, and she understood at once that he wasn't talking about pain. People weren't afraid of pain at this stage. They were afraid of being seen. She had sat beside enough patients to recognize that moment. The moment when someone accustomed to controlling everything had to extend an arm to another person, and no longer had control over anything at all. She offered no words of comfort. She simply told him to look at her. He asked what she meant. She said not to look at the needle, but to look at her. She would tell him exactly what she was doing, 1 step at a time, and when it was over, she would tell him it was done. He looked at her. He looked directly into her face without blinking, and Cora did exactly as she had promised. She said, "I'm cleaning the area. I'm choosing the site. I'm placing my hand now." Her voice was low and steady. The same voice she had once used with frightened elderly patients during night shifts at Bramwell. The voice she had thought she had lost along with her license. His hand relaxed. She completed the rest of the work quickly and neatly, without a single unnecessary sound. Then she said it was done. He continued looking at her for one more heartbeat before turning his face away. She stepped back, removed her gloves, and wrote on the monitoring sheet. As she wrote, she heard him say quietly that she was better than the other nurse. Cora said the other woman had done this 3 nights a week for 2 years, while she had done it only once. He said that was true, but the other woman had never told him to look into her face. Cora didn't answer. She sat in the small chair in the corner, leaving just enough distance between them, and they remained that way until the session ended, neither of them speaking again. And Salvatore, leaning his head back with his eyes closed, realized something he hadn't intended to realize that night. For 2 years, every time he sat in that chair, something inside his chest had drawn tight, the feeling of a man who had been caught doing something shameful. That feeling wasn't there tonight. For the first time in 2 years, he sat in that chair without feeling ashamed of being sick. 3 days later, during the afternoon session, he appeared in the dialysis room carrying a flat tin box. Wesley was lying in the chair with his head tilted to one side, a pair of cheap earbuds connected to a phone whose battery had died some time ago. He pulled a plastic chair closer, sat down, and opened the tin. Inside was a deck of cards so old that every corner had been worn round, their backs printed with a wine-colored pattern that had faded to pink. Wesley removed one earbud and asked what it was. He said Briscola. Wesley asked what that meant. He said it was how people passed the time in places like this before there were phones. He dealt the cards across the small table spanning the chair and taught the boy which card defeated which ones looked powerful but were worth almost nothing, and which ones seemed ordinary but decided everything at the end of the game. Wesley lost 3 games in a row and argued that rules like these made no sense. He said every set of rules seemed senseless to a beginner. Wesley won the 4th game and celebrated so loudly that the house painter in the neighboring chair turned and smiled. Halfway through the session, as Wesley gathered the cards and arranged them again, he asked who had taught him to play. The man didn't answer at once. He laid down a card, waited for Wesley to play his, then said it had been someone who once sat in that very chair. Wesley asked if he meant this chair, this place, this room. He said yes. Wesley asked if that person had been good at the game. He fell silent. The silence lasted longer than it normally would have. Long enough that Wesley looked up at him. Then he said that person had never once lost to him. Wesley said that meant the person was much better than he was. The man said yes, then played the next card in his hand, and the story ended there. From that day forward, the tin box appeared 3 times every week. Wesley began calling him boss, at first only to tease him, because he said the man looked exactly like one of those crime bosses in the movies when he dealt cards, except he was missing a cigar. He didn't correct him. Wesley used the name a few more times, then it became familiar, and eventually everyone in the room began using it too. The house painter would ask, "Boss, who won today?" Standing in the hallway, Cora watched through the square window in the door. She had stood there many times over the past several weeks, and each time she noticed something she hadn't seen before. She saw that he never sat directly across from her brother, but slightly to his right, on the side opposite the access, a position someone would choose only after spending hundreds of hours beside a person in that chair. She saw that he never looked up at the machine's screen, even though everyone who entered that room for the first time always looked at it. She saw that when Wesley began to tire and fell silent, he became silent too. He didn't try to force the boy into conversation. He only dealt the cards more slowly. She saw that he knew exactly when to offer a cup of water and when to offer nothing at all. And standing there with her arms folded across her chest, Cora understood that what she was witnessing wasn't the kindness of a stranger. A stranger's kindness was clumsy. It asked too many questions and made too much of itself. This was different. This was habit. This was a man who had done these exact things many times before, somewhere, with someone, for so long that his body still remembered even if his mind wanted to forget. She watched for a little while longer, and inside her, a question was steadily growing. The question the agreement she had signed didn't permit her to ask. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the hallway. A broad, heavily built man in a thick coat walked past, the kind of man Cora had begun to recognize after several weeks of traveling back and forth across the river. He didn't enter any of the rooms. He reached the middle of the hallway, slowed, then stopped completely. He looked at her. It wasn't the passing glance of someone walking by, but a gaze that lingered long enough for Cora to turn and meet it. She looked back at him. He didn't look away. Then he took his phone from his coat pocket, raised it to chest level, pressed the screen once, slipped it back into his pocket, and continued toward the stairs without saying a word to her. Cora didn't tell anyone about the man who had taken her picture in the hallway. She told herself that perhaps she had been mistaken. Perhaps he had been photographing the notice board behind her. And she allowed that thought to remain undisturbed in a corner of her mind for several days. Then, on Saturday night, the car arrived earlier than usual. And when she climbed inside, Salvatore was already sitting in the back seat. He said they had to stop somewhere first that night, and afterward they would go across the river. She didn't ask where. The car moved through the narrow streets of the neighborhood, and as Cora looked out the window, she began to notice things that someone could live an entire lifetime in that city without ever seeing. On one corner, a bakery was still lit, and its owner was pulling down the metal shutter. When the car passed, he stopped, straightened, and waited until it had gone by completely before continuing. Outside a tavern, several men smoking cigarettes automatically moved back against the wall, even though the street was wide and empty. At an intersection, a young man was sitting on top of a mailbox. When he saw the car slow down, he jumped off, removed the knit cap from his head, and held it in his hands. He said nothing. He simply stood that way until the car disappeared from sight. Cora remained silent. She had suspected part of the truth for a long time, but suspicion and seeing it with her own eyes were two different things. The car stopped outside a laundromat that was still open, its white light spilling across the sidewalk. He told her to wait there because he would only be a moment. He didn't tell her not to watch. Cora watched. Through the broad window at the front of the laundromat, she saw him walk inside, and a heavy-set man behind the counter immediately straightened his back. She couldn't hear anything. She only saw Salvatore pull out a chair, sit down, then remove the watch from his right wrist and place it face down on the counter. The other man began to speak. He spoke quickly, waving both hands and leaning forward. Salvatore didn't move. Then, after only a few seconds, the man fell abruptly silent. He stood there with his mouth still slightly open, unable to say another word, and the silence lasted so long that Cora, sitting in the darkened car, felt her hands grow cold. Salvatore picked up his watch, fastened it around his wrist again, then rose and walked outside. He didn't look back. 3 days later, the laundromat closed. There was no fire. No windows were broken. No one saw anyone come to cause trouble. It was simply that on Tuesday morning, the shipment of cleaning chemicals didn't arrive, and it didn't arrive on Wednesday morning either. When the owner called a second supplier, he was told they were out of stock that week, and when he called a third, no one answered. By the end of the week, the metal shutter came down and never rose again. Cora learned about it later from a patient in the waiting room, who mentioned it as a small piece of neighborhood news. That place had foreclosed on another family's home the previous fall, and now its owner had lost everything. What went around came around. But that night, when Salvatore opened the car door, climbed inside, and the driver pulled away from the curb, Cora knew none of that yet. She had only just watched one man silence another without raising his voice, and she understood that the document she had signed carried a price she had never accounted for. She remained silent for the length of a block. Then she turned toward him. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what he had just done inside. She didn't ask what would happen to the laundromat. She asked only one question, and she asked it in an ordinary voice, without trembling and without accusation. She asked whether he had ever harmed someone who owed him nothing. He didn't turn toward her. He looked straight ahead over the driver's shoulder and allowed the question to remain inside the car for a while before answering. Then he said no. One word. No explanation, no long account, not another word added to make it sound gentler. Cora gave a very small nod, then turned back toward the window. She didn't thank him. She didn't say she believed him. She didn't ask the driver to stop and let her out. Nor did she tell Salvatore that this made any of it all right, because none of it was all right, and both of them in that car knew it. The car continued across the bridge as the streetlights passed over the window in long streaks, and neither of them spoke again until they reached their destination. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday night, after the session had ended, and Cora was folding the monitoring sheet to place it in her bag, he asked her to stay seated for a moment. He took a thick, pale yellow envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the small table between them. He didn't push it toward her. He simply left it there. Cora looked at the envelope, then at him. She asked what it was. He said she would know when she opened it. She opened it. Inside were several printed pages, and a copy of the medical record, with 2 versions placed side by side, the original and the altered version, their differences already marked in faint pencil. Another page had been printed from the system access log, clearly identifying which account had opened the record and at what time, 3 days after her shift. There was also a copy of an internal email thread. It contained Mrs. Stroud's name, the department's name, and one brief sentence about the need to handle the matter quietly before the insurance company began asking questions. Cora read everything. She read slowly and carefully, and as she did, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but because for months she had wondered whether she had remembered it incorrectly, whether she had entered something wrong, whether she herself had been the one at fault. Now she knew she hadn't. She set down the final page. He said she could decide how she wanted it to end. She asked what he meant. He said that if she wanted, before sunrise, Mrs. Stroud would sit down of her own accord and write her resignation letter by hand, and the letter would include a sentence clearly stating that the medical record from that day had been altered. He said no one would touch her. No one would threaten her. It was simply that by the following morning, she would understand that writing that letter was the most pleasant of all the choices available to her. Cora sat without moving. She looked at the envelope. She thought about the suspension notice pressed between 2 pages of her notebook. She thought about the polite voice on the telephone that day. She thought about all the nights she had lain in the car wondering where she had gone wrong, and she realized that with a single nod, all those nights could be repaid to her within a matter of hours. Then she reached out, gathered the papers, aligned their edges, slipped them back into the envelope, and pushed it across the table toward him. He watched the envelope slide in his direction. He didn't pick it up. She thanked him, and she meant it. Then she said that if she reclaimed her name by frightening another woman so badly that she had to sit down and write a resignation letter in the middle of the night, Cora would only become another version of that same woman. There would be no difference between them. Mrs. Stroud had used her power to crush Cora, and Cora would be using his power to crush her in return. In the end, it would still be the strong defeating the weak, and Cora didn't want to win that way. He said nothing. She continued, her voice growing slower. She said there was one thing he didn't have among those papers. The elderly woman in the bed by the window that day was named Ruth. She was 81 years old, and she had asked Cora what time it was 4 times during a single shift. She had no idea what had nearly happened to her. Cora said Ruth deserved a real hearing, with records, with someone sitting there taking notes, and with a finding that anyone could read. She didn't deserve to have the matter settled in the dark and buried, even if burying it benefited Cora. Salvatore remained silent for a very long time. He looked at the envelope on the table, then at his own hands, then at the blank white wall across from him. In 20 years, no one sitting before him had ever refused something he offered. People accepted. They thanked him. Some cried, some fell to their knees, but no one pushed it back. And sitting there in the silent basement room, he realized that his way, the way he had used his entire life, the way that had given him everything he possessed, had just been exposed as cheap by a woman who had nothing left in her hands. He didn't argue. He took out his phone, selected a number, and when someone answered, he said briefly that all of it was to be submitted to the state board the following day. They were to follow the proper procedure, skip no steps, and if it took time, then they would let it take time. Aldo Serafino wasn't the kind of man who struck where his opponent was strong. He had sat at the Sunday table for enough years to know that Salvatore Ruggiero had no weakness at the docks, no weakness in the union, and no weakness anywhere money changed hands. What Aldo had was a photograph of the edge of a bandage beneath Salvatore's cuff, a photograph of a woman standing in the hallway outside a clinic in Kensington, and an address on Cardone Street, where Salvatore's money had flowed steadily for 9 years without bringing a single cent back to the organization. For 3 weeks, Aldo went to see people one at a time. He didn't speak against anyone. He merely asked questions, stayed longer than necessary, mentioned that the boss had been absent often lately, then left the thought unfinished. By the 3rd Sunday afternoon, when Salvatore arrived, the chair at the head of the table was still there, but both seats beside it were occupied, and no one stood to make room. He sat at the far end of the table, finished the meal, and said nothing. The real move came on Tuesday morning. A man wearing a city-issued jacket arrived at Teresa House. spent about 20 minutes walking around the ground floor, photographed the fire escape, photographed the electrical panel, took notes, then posted a yellow notice on the glass door and handed Doreen a copy. It stated that the facility was in violation of the fire code and had to stop accepting patients within 72 hours of receiving the notice. When Doreen finished reading, she sank heavily into a chair. She didn't cry. She simply took out the patient list and began to count. She counted more names than there were chairs in the waiting room, more people than any other facility within a 10-mile radius could take in, and among the names on that list was Wesley Lindstrom. Salvatore received the news less than an hour later. He immediately knew whose signature appeared at the bottom of the notice, and he knew who had just purchased that signature. For 20 years, he had settled matters like this before dinner, and he had settled them in only one way, the way that made people tear up the paper willingly and apologize for causing him trouble. He sat in the car outside the city building for a very long time. He thought about the pale yellow envelope being pushed back across the table, and the words that woman had spoken, that in the end it would still be the strong defeating the weak. Then he opened the car door and entered through the front entrance. He had no appointment. He sat for more than an hour among the other people waiting in the fourth-floor hallway, and when the inspector came out, Salvatore rose. The man recognized him immediately, and his face went pale for half a second before he managed to recover his composure. Salvatore didn't pull him into a secluded corner. He stood in the middle of the hallway where people were passing and said in an ordinary voice that he hadn't come there to threaten him. He said the inspector could leave his signature exactly where it was, if that was what he wanted, and Salvatore wouldn't touch him, wouldn't interfere with his job, and wouldn't pick up the phone to call anyone. The inspector began saying something about regulations, about how he was only performing his duty. Salvatore allowed him to finish. Then he said that in the room on Cardone Street, there was an elderly woman who brought a scarf she had knitted herself because her hands were always cold. There was a house painter who still went to work in the morning and came for treatment in the afternoon. There was a 19-year-old boy who had only just learned how to play cards. He said the inspector didn't need to remember their names. He only needed to understand that from that moment forward, every time he picked up a pen and signed his name to any piece of paper, anywhere, the name he had written would carry those people behind it. They would remain there for the rest of his life, and there was no one in this world who could remove them for him. Then Salvatore wished him a good day and walked away. The inspector remained in the middle of the hallway with the file in his hand, and it took him some time to remember where he had been going. Back on Cardone Street, the yellow notice remained fixed to the glass door, and Doreen had taken a pen and circled the deadline printed in the lower right corner so that everyone who entered could see exactly how much time was left. On the second night of the deadline, the clinic was still operating at full capacity because Doreen had said they would use every hour they had left. 7 patients lay in the chairs for the final session of the day, not quite halfway through their treatment. Wesley was in the third chair from the door. Cora sat outside at the reception desk, organizing patient files, the only task she was permitted to perform. Then the lights went out. They didn't flicker first. They simply died, across the entire floor, and the steady sound of the machines, a sound everyone had grown so accustomed to that they no longer heard it, stopped all at once. It was the silence that sent a chill down every spine. In the darkness, someone called Doreen's name. A chair scraped across the floor. One emergency light in the hallway came on, glowing a deep red and casting just enough light to reach the doorway. Doreen ran to the rear of the building, where the backup generator was kept. She returned almost immediately, and Cora heard her speak in a voice she had never heard the woman use before, saying that someone had tampered with it and it wouldn't start. Inside the treatment room, one of the 2 nurses working that night had only recently graduated. She stood in the middle of the aisle holding a flashlight, and her hand shook so badly that the beam leaped wildly across the ceiling. The other nurse was calling emergency services, and the dispatcher said ambulances were coming, but there weren't 7 ambulances for 7 people, and the blood trapped inside those lines couldn't wait. Cora rose from her chair. She knew exactly what the rules said about her at that moment. She knew that according to the state board's records, she was someone who wasn't allowed to touch a patient, wasn't allowed to perform a procedure, and wasn't allowed beyond that door in any capacity other than as a family member. She knew that if she crossed that threshold tonight, the nursing license she had spent 6 years studying at night to earn would never be returned to her. She also knew that if she remained seated, she would sit in the darkness listening to every person in that room breathe, and she would remember those breaths for the rest of her life, just as she still remembered the sharpness in her voice when she had spoken to her mother in the car that night. She walked inside. She took the flashlight from the young nurse's hand, handed it back to her, and told her to hold it steady, shine it on her hands, and not shine it in anyone's face. She told the other nurse to bring every remaining bottle of solution from the supply room and place one at the end of each chair. She told Doreen to stand outside by the door, direct anyone who arrived, and let no one enter the room. Then she went to the first chair. She told the elderly woman lying there to close her eyes. "I'm Cora. I'll tell you what I'm doing." Then she began the procedure. Every kidney nurse was taught, but most would never have to use in an entire career, returning the blood in the lines to each patient's body by hand, slowly and steadily, never too fast and never stopping. She counted aloud. She counted for the elderly woman, then for the next patient, and then for the one after that. Inside the room, there was only the beam of a flashlight, the sound of Cora counting, and the breathing of 7 human beings. Someone cried. Someone gripped her wrist, then released it. When she reached the third chair, Wesley opened his eyes, looked at his sister, and tried to say something. She told him to be quiet and let her count. 3 hours. She cared for all 7 of them without leaving anyone behind, and by the time the ambulances arrived, every patient was stable and sitting in the hallway wrapped in blankets. Not one of them had to be admitted to the hospital that night. The power wasn't repaired until morning. Doreen made coffee on a gas stove. Cora sat on the step outside the entrance, her hands still trembling, took out her phone, and found the number for the state board. Then she wrote a brief statement disclosing that the previous night, while under suspension, she had performed nursing procedures on 7 patients. She listed every action she had taken and concealed not one detail. She pressed send before she had time to reconsider. Salvatore arrived shortly before noon. He had already heard everything. He stood before her for a moment, then asked if she understood what she had just done to her case. She said she did. He told her no one had required her to report it. Not one person in that building would have reported her, even if they had been questioned. Cora looked up at him, her eyes red from being awake all night, and said she had spent her entire life studying for the right to do what she had done the night before. She said that if keeping her license meant standing outside the door and watching while people suffered in the darkness, then that piece of paper no longer meant anything. She said she would rather lose it. Less than a day remained before the deadline printed on the yellow notice. That afternoon, Salvatore told the driver to take him to the city building, and this time he didn't remain in the car. He had no appointment, called no one to clear the way, and asked no powerful name to vouch for him. He walked through the front entrance, stood in line to pass through the security scanner like everyone else, and when he reached the public service desk on the 4th floor, he waited for his turn. The woman behind the counter asked what he needed. He said he needed to see the head of the licensing department. She asked if he had an appointment. He said he didn't. She asked his name, and there, in a hallway where more than a dozen people sat waiting on plastic chairs, where 2 employees passed carrying stacks of files, and where a camera mounted in a corner of the ceiling pointed directly at the place where he stood, Salvatore Ruggiero gave his full name. He spoke loudly enough for the woman behind the counter to hear him clearly, without asking him to repeat it, which also meant loudly enough for the people seated in the nearest row to hear. He had never done that in a public place in his entire life. Those who knew who he was knew, but there had never been a recording, a ledger, or a signature documenting that he had personally stepped forward and declared his own name. That was the shield that had protected him for 20 years, and he had just set it on fire with his own hands in exchange for an appointment that wasn't on the schedule. The woman behind the counter stopped writing. She looked at him, then down at the paper, then picked up the telephone and called someone inside. He had to wait for nearly another hour. He sat on the row of plastic chairs with everyone else, between an elderly man holding a set of house plans and a young married couple seeking permission to repair their roof. No one gave up a seat for him. No one lowered their eyes. Here, he was only a man in a black coat waiting for his turn, and he sat with both hands resting on his thighs without looking at his watch even once. When he was finally called inside, he said nothing about himself. He placed the building records on the desk, along with the plans for the electrical system that had been inspected at the beginning of the year, the report from the most recent inspection, and a list of the people receiving treatment there, with every appointment scheduled for the next 2 weeks. He said he wasn't denying that there were deficiencies. He said he would correct every one of them according to the official list and pay for everything himself, and he was asking for enough time to complete the work without being forced to stop accepting patients, because if the facility closed, The names on that list would have nowhere else to go, and the man sitting across from him knew perfectly well whether there was another open place anywhere in the city. The head of the department asked what his connection was to the facility. Salvatore said he was the man who paid the bills. The man asked why. Salvatore was silent for a moment, then said the building bore his mother's name. The man asked nothing more. Near the end of the afternoon, someone from the office called Teresa House and said the deadline had been extended to allow the violations to be corrected, and the facility could continue operating during that period. After the call ended, Doreen stood leaning against the wall for a long time before walking outside and removing the yellow notice from the glass door. The following day, a local newspaper ran a brief story on an inside page about a free dialysis clinic on Cardone Street that had nearly been shut down and had received an extension at the last possible moment. It included the facility's name, Teresa House, and its street number. The story was less than 1 column long, tucked between an advertisement and the weather forecast, and almost no one noticed it. But the true price wasn't paid inside the city building. It was paid across the city, in private rooms behind restaurants, where printed copies of the article and footage from the camera in the 4th-floor hallway passed from hand to hand. In Salvatore Ruggiero's world, there was an unwritten law every man learned while he was still young. A man could do anything, as long as he never stepped into the light himself. Salvatore had just stepped into it in broad daylight, before government employees, and he had done it for a building that didn't earn a single dollar for anyone. When he arrived for Sunday lunch that week, the table had already been set, every seat was occupied, and someone else was sitting in the chair at the head. That night, after she had sent the disclosure letter and understood that everything concerning her profession was no longer in her hands, Cora sat on the folding bed in the family room and pulled the contract from her bag. She wasn't looking for anything dramatic. She only wanted to know what would happen to the agreement if she lost her license permanently, if the board issued its final decision and she was no longer a nurse, and whether the provisions for Wesley would be taken away with it. She needed to know how many days she had left to make arrangements. She turned to the final pages, to the fine print she had skimmed the first time, because she had been exhausted, and because, at that moment, she had only wanted to sign and be done with it. Section 7 concerned the termination of Party B's employment, and clearly stated that Party B had the right to terminate at any time by giving notice, without cause and without any obligation to repay. Section 8 concerned confidentiality, and was long and cumbersome, just as she had expected. Then she reached Section 9. She read it once and didn't understand, so she read it a second time, more slowly. The provision stated that in the event of Party A's death, loss of legal capacity, or inability for any reason to continue fulfilling the payment obligations, all financial obligations relating to the patient Wesley Lindstrom would be transferred immediately and unconditionally to a previously established irrevocable trust, regardless of any change in Party A's personnel, ownership, or status. Beneath that was another sentence, shorter than the first, stating that the obligation would remain in effect for the beneficiary's lifetime and couldn't be terminated under any circumstances, even if the agreement between the two parties had ended for any reason. By the time she read it a third time, her hands had gone cold. She turned back to the final page, where her hurried signature appeared beside his, and looked at the date written beneath them. She knew that date. It was the second night. The second night after she had stopped him in the middle of the train station to ask for directions. At that point, he hadn't known where she had worked. He hadn't known why her license had been suspended. He hadn't known what year her mother died, whether she had slept properly for even one night, or what her middle name was, because even now, he had never asked. He hadn't known whether she would sign. Yet before he laid those papers on the reception counter, he had already sat down with his attorney and told them to include a provision that would take effect only when he was no longer alive. Cora lowered the contract onto her lap. The family room was lit by a single, small table lamp, and the hallway outside was silent except for the faint sound of the machines coming from the room beyond. She thought about the bandage beneath his cuff at the station that night, the thing she had seen for only a fraction of a heartbeat, before telling herself she must have been mistaken. She thought about his answer when she had asked how long it had been. 2 years. He had said it as plainly as someone giving the time. She thought about the way he sat slightly to the right of her brother's chair, on the side without the access, and she understood that a person chose that place only if he had once sat on both sides. She remained that way for a very long time. Then she folded the contract, placed it back in her bag, and closed the zipper. She didn't get up to look for him. She didn't call. She wouldn't ask him a single question about Section 9, not that day and not the following week, because she understood that he had written it so no one would ever have to read it. And if she spoke of it, the only thing she would accomplish would be to take away his right to keep it to himself. But from that night forward, whenever Cora looked at him, she no longer saw the man who had placed his watch face down on the counter of a laundromat. She saw a man preparing for the day when he would no longer be there, a man who had finished making those preparations long ago. At the end of April, Dr. Renata Kaplan came all the way to Cardone Street, instead of asking Cora and Wesley to meet her at the hospital, and that alone said a great deal. She sat in the small room behind the reception desk, opened Wesley's file on the table, and told them plainly, without circling around the truth, that his name had been restored to the waiting list, but the waiting list was no longer a path forward. She said his heart had begun carrying the burden his kidneys could no longer bear, and the average time before someone on that list received the call was far longer than anything she dared promise him. She said the only path left was a living donor. Cora asked immediately, without needing to think, when she could be tested. Dr. Kaplan watched her for a moment, then asked whether she knew her own blood type. Cora said she did. The doctor asked whether she knew her brother's. Cora said she knew that too. Dr. Kaplan said nothing else. She simply wrote out the order and handed it to her. The testing was done the following morning. Cora had already known the result in her mind before the needle ever touched her arm. That afternoon, Dr. Kaplan called her in and spoke to her as one medical professional would speak to another, not as a physician speaking to a patient's family member. She said Cora's blood and Wesley's weren't the same type, that his body would recognize her blood as foreign from the very first hour, and that there was no way around it. She said Cora already understood that. Cora said yes, she understood. Then she sat in silence for a while before continuing in the same ordinary voice. She said she was a nurse. She had learned that chart in her first year and had explained it to more families in waiting rooms than she could remember. She said she had known since the day her brother received his first results, had known for a very long time, even before they boarded the train to this city. She said she had only hoped she remembered it incorrectly. She said she had gone over it night after night, considering every possible direction, and each time she reached the same answer. Eventually, she had stopped calculating. She had simply left the answer where it was, and hadn't dared to read it. Dr. Kaplan offered no words of comfort. She only placed a hand on the file and said she would broaden the search and contact every place she could. She spoke with the voice of someone who had made that promise many times, and had also failed to keep it many times. Cora thanked her. She rose, walked out, past the reception desk and the hallway where several drawings were taped to the walls, and even stopped to say something to the receptionist about the following week's appointment. Then she pushed open the door to the stairwell and closed it behind her. She descended 3 steps and sat on the 4th step from the bottom. She bent forward, covered her head with both hands, and broke apart. She made no sound. Her shoulders shook. Her breathing came in broken pieces, and she bit the back of her hand to silence herself, because on the other side of one wall was the room where her brother lay in the dialysis chair, and she had been practicing this since she was 19 years old, practicing until she had mastered it. She didn't know how long she cried that way. She knew only that for 8 years, she had sold everything she could sell, done everything she could do, and placed herself between that boy and every danger in the world. Yet when it came to the one thing a sister could give from her own body, she discovered that she couldn't give it, not because she was poor, not because she was a coward, only because her blood didn't match her brother's, and no amount of effort in the world could change that. In the stairwell, sound traveled upward with terrible clarity. Salvatore stood on the 3rd floor, landing with one hand resting on the railing, and he heard everything. He heard each broken breath rising through the narrow space between the floors. He remained there for a long time. He didn't go down. He could have. Going down would have been easy. Going down would have allowed him to believe he was doing something kind, and she would have been forced to stop crying, wipe her face, look up at him, and say she was all right. He had already stood on the other side of this moment. He knew the price of being seen that way, so he remained still, both hands gripping the wooden railing, until everything below had fallen completely silent. That night, he stayed late, sitting alone at the small table behind the reception desk after everyone else had gone home, and Doreen came in carrying an old envelope. She didn't sit down. She said she had meant to bring it to him 9 years earlier, when he bought the building and sent the first check. She said she had picked it up and put it away again more times than she could count, because she didn't think he was ready to bear it. She said he was ready now, or perhaps she no longer had time to wait for him to become ready. Then she placed it on the table in front of him, a little harder than necessary, and stepped back. Inside was a small sheet of yellowed paper with brittle edges, the kind of carbon copy form ambulance crews once used to record their calls. It bore a date. It bore the address of that building. It listed the time the call was received in slightly smudged ballpoint ink. It listed the time of arrival, and at the very bottom, in the notes box, there was a hurried handwritten line from the dispatcher on duty that day, stating that the ambulance had been blocked at the intersection at the end of the street because of a road closure at a construction site and had been forced to circle back twice. Salvatore read that line 3 times. For 20 years, he had known only one thing, that the ambulance had arrived 51 minutes late. He had believed it was because the neighborhood was poor, because no one hurried for streets like Cardone Street, because a human life there was worth exactly that much time. He had built his entire life around that belief. He read the name of the intersection again. That morning, the sun hadn't fully risen. His father had awakened him, handed him a thick envelope, and told him to take it to the corner at the far end of the street and place it directly into the hands of the supervisor, wearing a reflective vest. He wasn't to give it to anyone else. The 14-year-old boy had been pleased to be given an errand. He put on his coat and ran the whole way to keep himself warm. He found the right man, delivered the right envelope, and the supervisor patted him on the head, then pressed a few coins into his palm and told him to buy himself something to eat. The boy took the money and ran home, the ink from numbers someone had hurriedly written on the outside of the envelope still staining his fingertips. He reached home a little after 6:10. The apartment door stood open by the width of a hand. Salvatore lowered the paper onto the table. His hand didn't tremble. It simply rested there, spread open against the wood, and he looked at it as though it belonged to someone else. That construction site hadn't closed the street by accident that morning. Someone had paid for the road to be closed, so that a shipment could pass through somewhere without being seen, and the money had been delivered directly into the supervisor's hands by a boy who ran fast, could be trusted, and asked no questions. Salvatore hadn't been there when his mother collapsed. For 20 years, he had believed that was the worst of it, that he had been out on the street when she needed him. It wasn't. The worst part was why he had been out on the street. With his own hands, he had carried away the thing that stopped the ambulance that should have reached her in time. He opened his mouth to say something to Doreen, but no sound came out. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't brought it to punish him. She had brought it because she had watched him stand outside that door for 9 years, and she believed he had the right to know what it was he had been standing outside of. In a hoarse voice, he asked why she had kept it for so many years. She said it was because she had been his mother's friend. She said his mother had never known about the road closure, but Doreen had, and for a very long time, she hadn't told anyone, not even herself. Salvatore remained alone after she left. He thought about the key in his coat pocket, the thing he had carried for so long that he had forgotten the day he first began carrying it. He had always believed he couldn't open the door on the 3rd floor because a mother was waiting inside. Now he knew that wasn't true. What waited inside was a 14-year-old boy with ink still staining 2 of his fingertips, standing in the doorway a little after 6:10 in the morning, with no idea what he had carried away. And over the next 20 years, that boy grew into a man who entered the same business that had sent him out on that errand, took the same chair, and had a plate of food placed before him every Sunday afternoon. 3 days later, he summoned everyone to the room behind the restaurant on Passyunk Avenue. He brought 2 things with him. The first was the collection of medical debts the organization had purchased for next to nothing over the years. Stacks of files belonging to sick people who couldn't afford their medication, and he burned them in the metal barrel in the corner of the room. Burned them in front of everyone without offering a single word of explanation. No one stopped him. The second was what he placed on the table afterward. The ring of keys to the warehouses at the docks, the leather-bound ledger with its spine worn thin, and his father's ring, which he removed from his finger then and there. He said he wanted 2 things. Bruno Ferraro was to walk away from all of it cleanly, and no one was to go looking for him. And no one was ever to touch the house on Cardone Street, not today, and not 10 years from now. Other than those 2 things, he said. Everything on the table belonged to them. Aldo picked up the ledger, turned through several pages, then asked whether Salvatore knew how many names were written inside it, whether he understood how long it would take to build all of this again from the beginning. Salvatore said he knew because he was the one who had built it. Then he rose. For 20 years, whenever he stood up from a table, everyone in the room stood with him. This time, no one moved. They remained seated with their hands on the table and their eyes lowered, and he walked out through that silence alone. No one accompanied him to the door. Aldo left the room afterward with the ledger tucked beneath his arm. The first thing he did wasn't to call the capos. He found Cora in the parking lot behind the hospital, just as she was bringing Wesley out from a follow-up appointment. He stood leaning against her car door with his hands empty and greeted her by her full name. Cora said she didn't know who he was. He said she did. She simply hadn't met him yet. Then he took out his phone, turned the screen toward her, and showed her a photograph of herself standing in the hallway with her arms folded across her chest, looking through the square window in the dialysis room door. The photograph had been taken months earlier. He said he had known about her far longer than she realized. He said he hadn't come there to threaten her, and he proved it by handing her a document bearing a company letterhead, a signature, and an official seal. It was a written commitment to pay the entire cost of Wesley Lindstrom's transplant and all his medication for the following 2 years, with no conditions, no obligations, and not a single line requiring her to do anything in return. Cora asked what he wanted for it. He said he wanted her to leave the city that very night and say nothing to Salvatore. She was to let him believe she had taken the money and abandoned him. He said a man who believed he had just been betrayed would return to the same place, sit in the same chair, and do the same work he had always done because it was the one thing that would never betray him. Cora asked why he didn't simply kill him and be done with it. Aldo said he didn't want Salvatore dead. He said the entire city feared one name, and that name was worth more than everything in the ledger beneath his arm. He wanted Salvatore alive, and he wanted him living exactly as he had before. Then he delivered the final sentence as lightly as a remark about the weather. She was the thing that had ruined him. He left. Cora climbed into the car. Wesley had fallen asleep in the back seat at some point. She sat with the document resting against the steering wheel, and she remained there for a very long time. She read it from beginning to end. Then she read it again. There was no trap. She had read enough contracts in her life to know when a document was genuine. She thought about the waiting list, about what Dr. Kaplan had said regarding her brother's heart, and about how her own blood had failed to save him. She thought that with a single signature, she could give Wesley the one thing her body couldn't. She picked up the pen. She lowered its tip to the paper. Then her phone vibrated. It was a message sent from the back seat, while Wesley was still awake, probably about 10 minutes earlier. He had written, "Hey sis, I beat boss 2 games in a row today. He says it was luck, but I swear it wasn't." And there was a smiling face at the end. Cora stared at the message for a long time. Then she understood that what Aldo wanted to buy wasn't her. He wanted to purchase the past several months. He wanted to buy the plastic chair beside the dialysis chair, the tin box that held the cards, and the man who had sat down there. She set the pen aside. She took the document in both hands and tore it in half, then into quarters, and stuffed the pieces into her coat pocket. She never told Salvatore about it. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in a conference room on the 2nd floor of the board's building. The kind of room with a U-shaped table, small microphones mounted on metal bases, and more than a dozen rows of public seating that were usually empty. That day, they weren't. Doreen sat in the front row. Salvatore sat in the 3rd row beside the aisle, and he hadn't told Cora he would be there. The first part unfolded exactly as her attorney had said it would. The 2 versions of the medical record were submitted, along with the system access log and the email thread. The board asked questions, and Cora answered them briefly, without adding anything. Then it was the hospital attorney's turn. He didn't dispute the records. He passed over the entire matter and began discussing what he called the context necessary for the board to assess the witness's credibility. He opened another file and began reading into the microphone. He read that the witness had slept in her car for several weeks before the incident. He read that the witness had carried an unpaid medical debt for many years and that the account was in collection. Then he read the name of the entity collecting that debt. He pronounced all 3 words clearly into the microphone, in the middle of a room where the proceedings were being recorded, and a clerk was taking minutes. Cora didn't move. She had seen that name on the envelopes delivered every month for years, and she didn't consider it shameful. The humiliation came from hearing it dragged into that room as proof that a poor person couldn't be trusted. In the 3rd row, Salvatore Ruggiero sat as still as stone. He was the only person in the room who knew what the name they had just read aloud truly was. It belonged to the final branch beneath 3 layers of companies. The branch that purchased bundles of medical debt at a fraction of their value. The branch whose acquisition he had approved before he was 30, signing it along with a stack of other documents one afternoon, without reading a single person's name. And he couldn't stand up. He couldn't raise his hand and ask to speak. If he opened his mouth in that room, everything concerning her case would die where it stood. Her record would gain another line about her connection to a man like him, and everything she had sacrificed over the past several months would become meaningless. So he remained seated with both hands resting on his thighs and listened as they read the name of his own company, like an accusation against the woman sitting 3 rows ahead of him. The board recessed to deliberate. People slowly made their way into the hallway. He waited for her beside the window at the far end of the corridor, and when she reached him, he said her name. Then he said there was something he had to tell her now, before she heard it from someone else. He said the name they had read inside belonged to him. Cora didn't understand. He repeated himself more slowly. The entity that had purchased her mother's medical debt, the place she had sent money every month for all those years, was part of his organization, and the signature authorizing the purchase of that debt portfolio was his. She stood motionless for a long time. Then, in a quiet voice, she said she had gone without lunch for years to make those payments. She said she had taken extra night shifts and sold the only ring her mother had left her. There had been months when she paid that debt before buying her brother's medication because she was afraid they would call, afraid they would send another letter, afraid of the words printed in bold across the envelope. She said that for all those years, every month, her money had flowed into his pocket. And he hadn't even known her name. Salvatore didn't deny a single word. He said she was right. He said he hadn't known her name or the name of anyone in those files. Not one name among the thousands. And that was the worst part. Worse even than taking the money. He said people could only do such things when they didn't know anyone's name. Cora looked at him. She thought about the provision written in dry legal language that she had read 3 times in the night, and she thought about the date beneath his signature. She thought about both things at once, and she couldn't reconcile them within the same man. Then she told him to leave. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He gave a single nod, walked down the hallway toward the stairs, and didn't look back once. At the end of May, Dr. Renata Kaplan called Salvatore to the hospital, and over the telephone she said nothing except that he needed to come. Bruno Ferraro was already sitting in the room when Salvatore entered, his hands resting on his knees, his expression impossible to read. Kaplan didn't invite Salvatore to sit. She turned the monitor toward him and told him to look. She said the image showed Bruno's blood vessels at the end of the previous year, and she pointed to one area, explaining that it had been borderline at the time, still below the threshold. It had been noted and allowed to pass because the surgery was scheduled to take place within a few weeks. Then she switched to a second image taken the week before, and this time she didn't need to point. She said the rules required any living donor procedure postponed beyond the permitted period to undergo a complete evaluation again from the beginning. Bruno had completed that evaluation, and the transplant committee had refused to approve him as a donor. She said there was no way around it. No signature of hers could change the decision. Then she added that if they proceeded with the surgery as things stood, the person facing the greatest danger wouldn't be Salvatore. It would be Bruno. The room remained silent for a long time. Bruno spoke first, and he said only that he was sorry. Salvatore told him to be quiet. Then he turned to Kaplan and asked whether that area had truly changed within a few months, or whether someone had overlooked it the first time. She said no one had overlooked anything. She said that if the surgery had taken place in February as originally scheduled, it would have been over long ago. Salvatore would have been home by spring, and that spot would have remained quietly inside Bruno until whenever it chose to grow, with no consequences for anyone else. She didn't say it harshly. She spoke in the voice of a physician reading a line from a medical record. Salvatore rose, walked to the window, and stood with his back to them. He said he had only asked for 1 week. Kaplan looked down at the file before her, a file that had grown considerably thicker since the beginning of the year, and turned several pages. Then she said yes. He had asked for 1 week. He had asked for 1 week in February, then another week, then called her on a Sunday night to ask for 1 more. On another occasion, he hadn't called at all but had sent someone with a message. She said she had documented every request because she was his doctor, and she was required to record them. She said he had asked for 1 week more times than he dared remember. He didn't argue. He stood looking down at the parking lot below and made the calculation he had avoided making for months. He had postponed the surgery the first time because he wanted to see what had become of that building. He postponed it the second time because a 19-year-old boy had only just learned how to play cards. He postponed it the third time because a yellow notice had been posted on the glass door. Each time, he had a reason. Every reason had been right. Yet when all of them were added together, he had erased his only chance with his own hands, and taken with it the chance offered by the man sitting behind him, the man who had agreed to donate without asking for anything in return. Kaplan said she would put Salvatore back on the waiting list. She told him plainly that with his current numbers and the position he would receive after leaving the list and returning to it, she couldn't promise him anything. He asked about the boy. She said it was the same for him. Now both of them needed living donors, and she had no one left to offer either of them. Salvatore turned around, and Bruno was still sitting there with his hands clasped tightly together. Salvatore walked past him, placed a hand on his shoulder for a moment, then immediately withdrew it. He told Kaplan not to write anything in Bruno's medical record that might make it difficult for him to find work in the future. She said she never wrote records that way. Then Salvatore walked into the hallway, and it wasn't until he reached the elevator that he realized his hand was still clenched into a fist. The call came on Friday afternoon from the Transplant Coordination Department, a young voice reading from a prepared script, saying they were calling to confirm the request to withdraw from the waiting list that the patient had submitted on Tuesday, and asking whether Cora was the contact listed in the file. She asked the caller to repeat what she had just said. The woman read it again. Cora said there had been a mistake, and the woman replied that there was no mistake. The patient was 19 years old, legally entitled to make his own decision, and had signed the request in person with his attending physician present. Cora ended the call before the woman had finished and went straight into the dialysis room. Wesley was lying in the chair with his earbuds in, and when he saw his sister's face, he removed them very slowly, like someone who had been preparing for this moment for several days. Cora asked what he had signed. He said she already knew. She said no. She wanted him to say it aloud. He said he had withdrawn his name from the waiting list. Cora stood there with both hands trembling and told her brother that he had no right to do something like that behind her back, that she had spent 8 years keeping his name on that list, that he wasn't allowed to make a decision for both of them. She spoke in a voice that was almost a shout, something she had never done with him before. Dr. Kaplan walked in while they were arguing. She looked at the two of them and said plainly, without avoiding the truth, that she had entered her medical objection to the decision in his record, that he was a strong candidate, and there was no clinical reason for him to withdraw, and that she had told him so 3 times that day. She said she was required to respect the signature of an adult, but she didn't agree with his decision, and she never would. Wesley listened without speaking. Then he looked at his sister and told her to calculate it. She asked what he meant. He said she was always calculating things. Ever since he was little, she had sat down and calculated the cost of medication, the cost of gas, and which bill they would have to leave unpaid that month. He said she could calculate this for him now. If there was only one kidney available, should it go into his body or into the other man's? Cora said there was no calculation like that. Wesley said there was, and she had already made it. He said he had seen her face in Dr. Kaplan's office on the day she learned that her blood didn't match his, and he knew she had reached the answer at that moment. She simply hadn't dared to read it aloud. Cora couldn't speak. Then he continued, his voice growing quieter. He said she had raised him with her entire youth. She had given up school, given up her friends, given up everything, and he had received so much from her that he couldn't count it anymore. He said he didn't want the next gift she gave him to be part of her own body. He wanted, once in his life, to be the person who gave, instead of the person who received. Then he said one more thing, and it made Cora sit down. He said, "Sis, I've known he was sick since that first night at the station." She asked what he was talking about. He said that when Salvatore lifted the bag onto his shoulder, his sleeve slipped back, and Wesley had seen everything. He had kept it secret ever since, even from her, because he was afraid that if she knew, she would push Salvatore away. He said he had spent his whole life sitting in rooms like this one, and everyone who sat beside him looked at him with that same expression, the expression that said, "Poor boy." Salvatore was the only person who had never looked at him that way. He said, "It's because he sits in the same chair I do, sis." Salvatore arrived the following afternoon. He asked no questions, offered no advice, and said nothing about forms or waiting lists. He pulled the plastic chair closer, set the tin box on the table, opened it, and began dealing the cards. Wesley said he didn't want to play. Salvatore said he hadn't asked whether Wesley wanted to. Then he said they would play one game, and there would be terms. If Wesley won, Salvatore would personally sign a request to remove his own name from the waiting list that very afternoon, with Dr. Kaplan as a witness. If Salvatore won, Wesley would tear up his request and never mention the matter again. Wesley studied him for a long time. He said Salvatore cheated. Salvatore said he knew. Then he pushed the hand of cards toward the boy and said, "And yet you're still sitting down to play?" He arrived one morning in early June, walking there by himself, opening the door himself, and standing at the reception desk to say he wanted to speak with the person in charge. Doreen came out. He asked if this was the house at that number on Cardone Street, and she said it was. He nodded, then stood silently for a moment, as though he had rehearsed what he intended to say next, and had suddenly forgotten it. At last, he said he had read the name of the place in the newspaper, in the brief story from the previous month about how it had nearly been shut down. He said his name was Hollis Dunbar. He said he had driven an ambulance in that neighborhood for nearly 30 years and had retired several years ago. Then he took out his wallet, opened its innermost compartment, and removed a sheet of paper, folded into quarters, softened by time, and by having been opened and folded again too many times. Doreen looked at the paper and sank heavily into a chair. She told someone to call Salvatore. He arrived 40 minutes later. He walked in and saw an old man sitting on a plastic chair in the waiting room, his large hands resting on his knees. On the small table before him lay the ambulance call sheet, exactly like the paper Doreen had thrown onto Salvatore's table, except this one was the original and bore an additional signature in the lower corner. Hollis Dunbar stood. He said he had been the man in the driver's seat that morning. He said he had been the one who pushed the stretcher through the door on the 3rd floor. He remembered the apartment number, remembered the staircase, remembered a boy standing at the end of the hallway whom no one had thought to move away. Then he said, 51 minutes, and he spoke those 3 words like a man who had repeated them silently every day for 20 years. He said he hadn't come there to ask for forgiveness. He had no right to ask for that. He had come for something else. He said he had registered as an organ donor many years earlier, as a donor to a stranger with no designated recipient, shortly after his retirement. He had waited ever since, and no one had ever called. He said he had read the newspaper story and thought this might be his last chance. Then he looked at Salvatore and said the one sentence he had prepared. He only wanted the chance to arrive on time once. Salvatore said nothing. He stood in the middle of the waiting room with an image of this man that had been living inside his mind for 20 years. A faceless shadow behind a steering wheel, something he had hated with all the strength of a 14-year-old boy, and later with all the coldness of a grown man. Now that shadow stood before him, old, his shoulders stooped, and his hands trembling faintly. Salvatore thought about the thick envelope, the handful of coins, and the ink staining his fingertips, and he understood that if anyone owed an apology in that room, it wasn't the old man. The silence lasted so long that Doreen had to turn her face away. Then Salvatore stepped forward, extended his hand, and thanked him. 2 words and nothing more. The tests were performed that same week. Hollis's blood was compatible with Wesley's, and when Dr. Kaplan completed the remaining compatibility tests, she called Cora into her office and told her something Cora had to ask her to repeat twice. Cora's blood wasn't compatible with her own brother's, but it was compatible with Salvatore Ruggiero's. Dr. Kaplan explained that this was called a paired exchange, that thousands of people survived because of it every year, and that it required only enough people willing to give without insisting that their gift go directly to the person they loved. 4 human beings, 2 operating rooms, a circle completed. On the morning of the surgeries, 2 stretchers were wheeled side by side through the hospital's 3rd-floor hallway, and they paused briefly where the corridor divided. Cora turned her head toward him. She said, "If I wake up and you don't, I'm going to be very angry with you." He told her not to worry, because he had never allowed anyone to stay angry with him for long. She said he owed her something money couldn't repay. He said he knew, and if he woke up, the first thing he would do was invite her to dinner somewhere with proper tablecloths. She said she didn't own a dress. He said she would have one of his kidneys inside her, and he thought that was formal enough. Then the 2 stretchers turned in opposite directions, and the doors closed. No one had arranged it that way. The operating room schedule had been set weeks earlier, based on when both surgical teams were available and when all 4 people were eligible, And when Dr. Kaplan read the date aloud, Salvatore asked her to repeat it once to be certain, then said nothing more. June 9th. That morning, before going upstairs, he gave Doreen the brass key. She took it, looked at it resting in her palm, and asked what he wanted her to do with it. He told her to open the room on the 3rd floor. He said to clear it out, paint it, bring in beds, and turn it into a place where the families of patients who had traveled from far away could sleep instead of spending the night in the hallway. He told her to fit as many beds as the room could hold. Doreen was about to say something, but he had already turned away. That morning, in the 3rd floor hallway of the hospital, a round clock hung on the wall opposite the row of waiting chairs, and Doreen Kowalski sat beneath it from the moment the 2 stretchers turned in opposite directions. She had brought the tin box with her. She didn't open it. She simply kept it on her lap, with both hands resting over it. And she sat that way, occasionally lifting her eyes to watch the hands of the clock move forward 1 mark at a time, neither faster nor slower. 4 months later, on an afternoon in late autumn, Wesley Lindstrom drove his sister's old car to the vocational school on Broad Street, where he was in his first year studying automotive repair. He still had to take medication every day, still had to undergo regular tests, and Dr. Kaplan still scolded him whenever he arrived late. But he drove himself. He had gained weight, and he had begun complaining about his schoolwork, like every other young man. Cora had regained her nursing license. The 2nd hearing was held in public, with a recording and an official transcript, and the night of the power outage was considered along with testimony from the 7 patients, Doreen, and the 2 nurses who had been on duty. The board concluded that Cora had acted beyond the scope permitted to her and entered that finding into her record, while also restoring her license. During the same hearing, the altered medical record from Bramwell Hospital was referred to the medical board's disciplinary division. Dr. Vance lost his right to practice medicine. Mrs. Stroud submitted her resignation, not in the middle of the night, but after a 3-month investigation and a final report that anyone could read. Everything happened slowly, through paperwork and proper procedure, without a single step being skipped. Salvatore had left his old world before the surgery. Aldo Serafino took the chair at the head of the Sunday table, and no one challenged him for it. Salvatore hadn't won that game. He had simply walked away from the board, keeping only one thing: the red brick building on Cardone Street. Hollis Dunbar recovered faster than anyone had expected, and that autumn, he spoke at 3 churches in the neighborhood and told his story. Afterward, several more people registered as donors to strangers, and one of them was matched with a woman in New Jersey, whom no one in this story had ever met. That afternoon, on the 3rd floor of Teresa House, the window stood open to the last sunlight of the season. The room had been repainted pale yellow and furnished with 4 single beds, though no one had come to stay there that day. 3 people sat on the window seat, the place where a woman had once sat mending clothes before the daylight faded. The old deck of cards was spread across the wooden surface between them. Wesley won the 2nd game, and celebrated as though he had won an entire season. Then, rather suddenly, he asked if Boss regretted it. Salvatore gathered the cards in his hand without looking up and said he didn't. Then he added, "I'm not lying to you. If anyone ever harms your sister, I still know who to call." From the small kitchen in the corner of the room, Cora called out that he wasn't calling anyone. He laughed and said, "I haven't called anyone. There are doors we keep locked for years because we believe there is nothing but pain behind them, only to discover when we finally open them that they lead to the one place where we can heal. And sometimes life doesn't allow us to save the person we long to save, but it always sets aside someone else for us. What matters isn't what we once did, but whether we have the courage to stop and choose again." If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and share it so that each day we can gather again to hear more stories of human kindness. Please leave a few words in the comments about how you feel toward Cora, toward Wesley, and toward the man who finally walked through his own door, because we truly want to hear what lies deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.